I think Howard probably doesn't need any introduction, the Copake historian. We're very glad to have him here to talk about his latest book.
Thank you. I was actually told that there probably would not be a big crowd here tonight, but the person who told me that said that it would be about a dozen or more of the most important people in Copake. You may not believe that, but I said it. So this presentation, in a way, is an advertisement for one of the 5 or 6 most important draws to Copake. And as town historian, I have been saying to people that Copake is more than a town now. It is a destination. We have the museum, the Ray Jan Historical Society Museum, Bashfish Falls, which really is in Copake, no matter what the Massachusetts folks say. The ironworks, the exhibit, the history exhibit in Town Hall now. And what have I left out?
The library.
And the library, excuse me. And Rheinstrom Hill. Now, Rheinstrom Hill is in the process of expanding their profile to get more people to come there. We've been there a number of times and it's absolutely delightful. And birders go there. More people can go there too. Anyway, I want to, let's see. I want to explain the book title. And for those several people who heard my talk 2 weeks ago, there's a repetition of the beginning of this, but I think about 95% of it is new tonight. So my book title, the book is The Man Who Sold Superman. Well, this is not the resale copy, but anyway, The Man Who Sold Superman to the World. The title reflects that Carroll Rheinstrom, the subject of this biography, which represented DC Comics, the publishers all around the world. And Superman was probably his biggest seller. So I want to say how I came to write this book. Somebody told me about this man, Carroll Rheinstrom, who I'd never heard of him up to that point. And from what he said, he was a wealthy businessman. He was a philanthropist. He had a foundation. So I decided I want to write an article for the Columbia paper about him. And I was steered to call Ed Harrington of the lumber and hardware business. And I told him of my interest. And he said to me, funny you should call. We're looking to hire somebody to write Rheinstrom's biography. Boom! I walked into a very happy situation. So the book was published this summer, and it got some good reviews initially, and they're still coming out now. Normally, when one starts to write a book, to research and write a book like this, you go to the library and you look for books about the person, books that mention him, look at Wikipedia. Rheinstrom's name did not appear in any other books except primarily a book written in Portuguese that discussed his going to Brazil to deal with a publisher there. And there are books about people that are connected to Rheinstrom, people that I discuss in the book. Joe and Jerry, who were the 2 high school students at the time when they wrote the first Superman story. And Rheinstrom's 2 bosses, there are biographies of them. But I then started to research Rheinstrom himself. And what I did find in 2 or 3 years of research was that there were articles about him, and there were a number of people who knew him, some of them local. So I interviewed Marilyn Beckley Harrington, and Mike Fallon. Mike didn't know him, but not Mike had gone, well, maybe he did. He went to Rheinstrom Hill in connection with his business and looked at the art and the art collection that Rheinstrom had. And Neil Howard, the superintendent of schools, whom I spoke to in connection with the swimming pool at the school that was funded with Rheinstrom's money. And then around the country, I spoke with a couple of three relatives of Rheinstrom's second wife who knew Rheinstrom. So I was able to find people. And then hear a little more about that. Carroll Rheinstrom was an interesting man. He had a difficult but interesting childhood. He was into acting a little bit in his younger years. He was an expert in advertising for that first company that he worked for, a magazine publisher. He was married 3 times. He spent 50 years in Copake, initially part-time, and then moved up here full-time. And he was an outdoorsman, which is connected with the fact that he and his wife planted seedlings, something like 75,000 seedlings on Rheinstrom Hill. So the biography is warranted. People said to me, why write a biography of him besides the fact that you were asked to? Rheinstrom in his 2 businesses disseminated American culture throughout the world. And that has a lot to do with it. So the first person that Rheinstrom worked for was a man named Bernard McFadden. McFadden was a very successful businessman. He made a lot of money, but he also was a man who went to extremes. For example, let me read this to illustrate my point. Based on a theory of voice development that he devised, McFadden would sometimes break into baying or mooing. As an opponent of the fashion industry, he continued to wear the same clothes until eventually they wore out on him. At one point, he developed the conviction that the AMA was trying to poison the wells on his estate. Does he sound like a man who goes to extremes? Okay. Carroll developed that expertise as an advertiser working for McFadden, but there was a very bizarre nature to his employment. Carroll Rheinstrom was Jewish, but he was a closet Jew. He hid his identity. He held it close to his vest. And some people who knew him for years were unaware of that. When I was talking with the president of the Rheinstrom Hill Community Foundation, and I said something about Rheinstrom being Jewish, she said, oh, no, I don't think so. I said, well, it was confirmed in some of the papers that I have received from this man. Well, what's the bizarre nature of his employment? Well, number one, McFadden, his boss, employed a Nazi sympathizer named Viereck, a man who had immigrated from Germany, into the United States from Germany, and who was such an admirer of Hitler that he wrote a very pro-Hitler piece for a magazine. In addition, McFadden himself was very clearly an anti-Semite. And again, I'll go to the book to confirm that. McFadden distributed an office memo stating his conviction that Jews, whom he referred to as a certain race, backed communist activity in Russia and wanted to foster it in every country. Then in 1938, McFadden told an interviewer that he felt that the Jews were attacking the American system and that the time was near when the Jewish question, using Nazi language, right, should be brought out into the open more forcibly. Finally, McFadden owned a hotel in Miami Beach, which had a sign stating, "No Jews, no dogs allowed. So McFadden Rheinstrom did very well working for this company, and he was recognized for his prowess. In fact, at one point, there was talk about Rheinstrom becoming the president of the company. Carroll Rheinstrom was very well connected, both in Copake and in his business ventures. When he needed some help of a political nature, he contacted a man named Nelson Rockefeller, former governor and vice president, not at that time, but from that company, from that wealthy family. When he needed references to people in the countries that he was visiting, and he wanted to make some contacts, he contacted a prominent New York Times editor whom he knew, who may have been a friend also. After World War II, Rheinstrom and his second wife, Irene, did a great deal of traveling. And this was initially as his employment with McFadden was diminishing. And one day, the president or one of the two owners of DC Comics, which published Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman and Hopalong Cassidy and Dale Evans and Sergeant Rock, asked him to stop by the office. And so when he did, Donenfeld said to him, "How would you like to represent us, DC Comics, around the world?" After Carroll arrived at the office. "You're traveling anyway. This way you could be our agent and still continue your traveling. We'll give you the exclusive right to represent us abroad. What do you say?" Rheinstrom said yes. And he continued to go to Paris and parts of Germany and Mexico City, doing business with publishers in all those countries. What he was doing was selling DC licenses to publish those titles, the ones I just mentioned. Now, around the time, excuse me one second. Around the time that Rheinstrom is beginning to represent DC Comics, another man came into the news. A man named Frederick Wortham, who was an immigrant from Germany. He was a psychiatrist. He had a clinic in Harlem that he was doing research with the young patients in the clinic, connecting them with comic books. And he concluded that comic books were harmful to kids. He especially focused on crime and horror comic books. And that was in 1948. And he set off a national discussion and gained followers. Some in a couple of communities, there were burning of comic books, which might remind you of the burning of the books in the Nazi era in Germany. In 1954, Wortham published a whole book on this subject called Seduction of the Innocent. Wortham testified to Congress, and this gives you, I'm going to read something that gives you a little sense of what he was saying, because he wasn't only going after the crime and horror books, he also went after Superman. And he criticized many comic books with a jungle theme. Progressive that he was, he stated that the jungle-themed ones characterized people of color as subhuman. He also claimed that the superhero titles, particularly Superman, promoted the use of violence. Superman, wrote Wortham, with a big S on his uniform, which should, I suppose, be thankful that it is not an SS, needs an endless stream of ever new submen, criminals, and foreign-looking people, not only to justify his existence, but even to make it possible. It is this feature that engenders in children either one or the other of two attitudes. Either they fantasize themselves as Superman, with the attendant prejudice against the subman, or it makes them submissive and receptive to the blandishments of strong men who will solve all their social problems for them by force. Now, one can argue that Superman was the equivalent of a, what do we call the groups that try to take the law into their own hands? Vigilantes. So this presented a problem to Rheinstrom because he's trying to sell comic books, and this man is making a big splash saying that they're bad, they're dangerous for your children. I have to say that it was somewhat of a challenge to write about Rheinstrom's travel abroad. For some countries, I found some good sources where I got Rheinstrom front and center. But otherwise, for some countries where I know he did business, we don't see him. We don't hear the stories about him, but I can tell you things about what was going on in those countries in relation to those comic books. Now, one country in which we do see, in the book, you see Rheinstrom, so to speak, was Brazil. As the anti-comics movement was getting started, the Brazilian publisher got very concerned, very upset, and contacted Rheinstrom, and Rheinstrom came running. He took the first plane that he could to Brazil. He brought with him some of the materials that an organization of comic book publishers were preparing to deal with, to counter the anti-comic books movement. In Brazil, there were one or two cases of some young men who committed murders. And this happened in some other countries. They found comic books in their homes, and they assumed that there was a causal relationship. I'm wondering if in all of the homes they had found cauliflower, whether they would claim that eating cauliflower contributed to carrying out murders. France was an interesting case history of Rheinstrom's dealings with a foreign publisher. At one point, when we were in Denmark, and we had drinks with a publisher that had done business with Rheinstrom, he said to me, "How did you come to me? How did you locate me?" And I couldn't really answer him. But when you do research like this, you take a stab and try to find someone who's publishing comic books and say, any idea who? And eventually I got to this man, Karsten Sondergaard. So I kind of got to a man named Robert Trout in France in the same way. He was a 91-year-old man, and bless his heart, he was on email. And so we had an exchange, and he gave me some good little stories, including that he realized that Rheinstrom, for all the money, and he was making a lot of money from comic books, he didn't like comic books. In fact, nobody who was ever in Rheinstrom's house ever saw a comic book. So I think he was embarrassed. In fact, Rheinstrom didn't talk to reporters very much, but his wife did. And she would tell them about his business, and she would say he represented publishers of magazines. So she masked the fact that those magazines were comic books. France was an interesting case about the anti-comics movement. It was fueled by two groups that you would not expect to see eye to eye. One was the Catholic Social Democrats, and the other one was the French Communist Party. Well, they came from different starting points as to why they opposed comic books. The Catholic Social Democrats were concerned because there had been a lot of collaboration in France during World War II. And now they wanted to change the French national identity, starting with kids. But American comic books were not going to help that occur. So they came out against these American comic books. At the same time that the Communist Party was bothered by the fascist theme that they interpreted in especially Superman. Okay. As I said, you know, if there was a crime, well, maybe I didn't say that. If there was a crime that occurred, Superman wouldn't say, let's call the police. He would act in lieu of the police. And there's, you know, a case to be made there that that kind of behavior is not what we want in a democratic society. Italy was another country in which there was an anti-comics movement. The Catholic Church was involved with that. The publisher was a man named Mondadori in Milan. And Rheinstrom had to deal with the fact that it was difficult in the beginning to get the comic books in Italy. Mondadori, when he did start to publish Superman, he didn't want to use that name, and he called him the Nembo Kid. Batman he called the Wing of Steel in the beginning. Eventually, they changed it to the American names, to the real names. The effort in Italy did not succeed in passing a law against comic books, but Mondadori got frightened enough by the possibility that a law would be passed that he wound up doing what people sometimes do in countries where there is censorship. He did self-censorship. In the Soviet Union, people would censor themselves because they were afraid that they would be censored by the state, and in other countries, undemocratic countries too. So in Italy, Mondadori had his artists redraw Superman and Batman so that they wouldn't look so sexual, so that they wouldn't look so alluring. If there was a little bit of nudity in a comic book, or a hint of nudity, if there was a couple kissing, they would delete them from the visuals. I don't know why this happened, but there was they took out a dog from one comic book and substituted for it a corpse. So they, you know, you can't always look for rationality among censors, even if it's people doing self-censorship. Mexico also. Now, Mexico, you know, I have Rheinstrom appearing in Mexico. Good friends with a man named Luis Navarro, who was with a publishing company called Editorial Navarro. In Mexico, there was an anti-comics movement going on for years, even during World War II and earlier, because there were some comic books that appeared there. And then the law would be passed, and then it would be forgotten, and then a wave of anti-comic sentiment would grow again, and it would be forgotten. And eventually it faded away. I interviewed a man when we were on vacation in Mexico City a couple of years ago, and he didn't know Rheinstrom, and he also didn't really have anything to do with publishers. His story was that, and this was why I was interested in him, as a boy, he said that he learned to read from comic books, which is an interesting statement that flies against some of the things that the anti-comics people were saying, that reading comic books distracts kids from good reading. Well, reading comic books sometimes, because I have a second case too, where that happened in Colombia. I don't know how widespread it was, where somebody learned to read from comic books. Hello. Okay, so Mexico was interesting for another reason. It was one of two cases where a publisher in a country wound up handling a language area. Now, I don't know exactly why Rheinstrom didn't want to go to all the rest of South America, probably because it would be too time consuming, and maybe the number of comic books that would have been sold in Peru or sold in Colombia would have been too small. But he did this arrangement where Mexico could sort of subcontract to get comic books into these other countries. And one of the countries that he also subcontracted, that Navarro subcontracted to, was Spain. Now, Spain's an interesting story during the era of the fascist dictator, Francisco Franco. What's this, anybody recall this slogan for Superman?
After that, beating bullets.
That's one. Truth, justice,
and
the American way. Francisco Franco's regime didn't want to hear that.
No.
So you know what they did? They carried out a press campaign against Superman. The newspapers published stuff from the government criticizing Superman. Okay?
Yeah, wasn't the Franco American way?
No, let's not get spaghetti into this. Okay. In Germany too, Rheinstrom developed a personal friendship with the publisher, a man named Adolf Copake. Now, Germany, after World War II, wanted to get rid of some of the things connected with the Hitler era, the Nazi era. And a dominant philosophy in the Hitler era was the philosophy of the super race. Superman? So the publishers were afraid to publish Superman initially. It took a while. Finally, Copake published it, took a chance. There might be backlash, and there wasn't. And it did very well. In fact, in one particular year, there were more Superman comics published in Germany than in the United States. So, you know, the Danish publisher said to me, how did Rheinstrom make most of his money? And I said, I believe through comic books. He said, and he was in the business with him. He said, I don't think so. I don't think he was making that much. But there's something I forgot to mention at that time that he kind of knew too. When Rheinstrom would go to these countries, he would stay in the most elegant, expensive hotels. And it wasn't on DC Comics' dime because he didn't work for them. He was an independent agent. So he was making a lot of money. Okay. And as I said, he was friends with Copake. He visited them in their home, and they visited him in Rheinstrom Hill. They stayed in his guest house that I think he had built at that point. If you were walking up the path to Copake Falls on a certain day in August 1977, you may have passed Rheinstrom escorting the Copakes up to Copake Falls. So he had this capacity to make these friendships, even though, as I was saying 2 weeks ago, he also was could be a pretty difficult person. Anyway, the next to the last country I'll talk about, again, a language area, is Lebanon. A woman named Layla Sheehan de Cruz was the publisher in Arabic in Lebanon. And she again subcontracted to Saudi Arabia, to Egypt, to several other countries because she was publishing in Arabic. Now, I interviewed her by phone. I wasn't going to go to Beirut. And I have to say, I got a kick out of talking to somebody that distance away who was living in a city that I wasn't going to go to. And it was a good interview. She also was in her early 90s. Now, publishing in Arabic was tricky because what do we know about Arabic, how it's written? Right to left. You're the only one who reads in Arabic. And so how do you do that? Because how they got the materials from New York, from DC Comics, was they had films. And the films were used to produce the page. So what Lila did was she reversed the page, which worked the trick, and they deleted the text from the speech bubbles, and then she put in the Arabic. Now, in doing that with Superman, there was a little tiny problem. Superman had an S on his chest, but now she didn't take away the S. The S was reversed. Small problem. In the Arabic issues too, there were cultural issues. You cannot have a dog in the house, in an Arab house. Yeah, you cannot have a dog in an Arab house. So she took the dog that was in a particular story, and she moved the dog to the garden. She also had problems with Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Saudi Arabia being, as it still is, so culturally conservative, they wound up blocking her shipments of comic books to that country at times. There was also an issue that she had, that she perceived. There was a Batman series called The King of Crime. Now, why might she want to change that title in the Middle East? Because there were monarchies there, and she was afraid that some monarch might take it personal. And so she changed the title. Now she ran into, this is kind of a little bit of an aside, but she ran into a problem living in Beirut at the time that she was, and publishing there. So I will read to you this little piece of evidence of that problem. Normally, one would not think of publishing comic books as something that one would call brave. However, that word must be applied to the Cruz. In 1975, a 15-year-long civil war began, which caused some 120,000 fatalities and many injuries. With daily shelling of civilian residences in Beirut, the environment hardly seemed conducive to carrying on business. Yet the Cruz persisted. One day during a 19-month period of nonstop shooting and mortar attacks, while she was in her kitchen, an artillery shell slammed into her high-rise apartment building, sending pieces of shrapnel into her face, her neck, arm, and torso. Fortunately, a plastic surgeon did some wonderful repair and reconstruction on her, after which she and her family went into exile for 9 months. So obviously, Carroll Rheinstrom was not going to Beirut. She would come to New York when she needed to pay and also to do some other business. And I got a story from the woman who succeeded Rheinstrom that when she dealt with Layla, Layla came with a suitcase full of money. Scandinavia is the last place that I'll talk about. And as I referred to, Rheinstrom had a personal friendship with a man named Karsten Sondergaard. His photo is in the book when he was a young man. He was quite a bit younger than Carroll. And we know that Scandinavian countries as being pretty progressive, pretty liberal. But surprisingly, there was some real hostility towards comic books from some people, including one, I think he was a Swedish politician, who said the people producing comic books should be locked up. Some pretty strong sentiment. Now, there was something called co-printing. It relates to what I said before about the films. There was co-printing in the Scandinavian countries. So one publisher would get the films from New York, and they didn't have to reverse it because that was an Arabic problem. But they took out the words in the bubbles. And then for their country, they would put in the language. It was Danish. They put in Danish. And then they would send it on to the same, what do they call them? Pages. And then in Sweden, they would put in the Swedish text in the speech bubbles. Carroll Rheinstrom retired in 1982. And this Dutch woman took over from him. His second wife, the love of his life, had died in 1977. He lived on until 1994, had one unhappy marriage during that period, and died in 94. Not the graves exactly, but the places where their ashes are buried in Rheinstrom Hill. And we went there when we did the tour of the facility. So when he died, the Audubon Society got the property, 1,000 acres, okay? And that's where we did the walking tour. At some point, I'd like to do another one. And if I do, I'll publicize it. Maybe if you haven't gone there, you might want to do it. So that concludes my presentation about Carroll Rheinstrom, whose biography of him. And I have to say, it was a lot of fun. He was an interesting man to write about. Thank you for coming. And now I will take any questions. Should you have some? Yes.
Did you tell us when he was born?
I was supposed to. He was born in 1904. Yeah.
Yeah.
He was born in Harlem, in a German Jewish community. And as I told the group 2 weeks ago, he had a problematic, well, I don't know if I said it then, he had a problematic childhood, but he was a Boy Scout. And in 1918, he and a group of other Boy Scouts came up the Hudson River on a Hudson River dayliner to the city of Hudson, disembarked. They had a big wagon because they were going to stay the whole summer. They had lots of equipment. And they hiked through Claverack, slept for a while in front of the school there, and then got kicked out of the area and went on to Copake Falls, where they set up camp next to the ore pit and had some adventures there. Carroll that first night met a man named Sterling Wyckoff and began a lifetime friendship with him. And well, I'm going into where I was talking. So I'm talking about this next time. Yeah. Anyway, any more questions? Yes.
How you mentioned about how wealthy he was, and obviously continued to be from his efforts. Did you get into any kind of what his contractual arrangements were, or how he was paid, or bonuses for a particular country, or any kind of
I
structure?
don't have any evidence that he got bonuses, but I said he was a free agent, and it was an interesting contract. He got this arrangement. This contract was for life. So he went on. He probably went on longer than they might have wanted to. I'm guessing he might have slowed down by the time he was retired in 1982. But in any case, I found a copy of a contract. I don't think it was the only one, and it talked about how he would get paid. I think it was a portion of the, of the signing amount. There were certain kinds of information that evaded. For example, DC Comics might have archives pertaining to him, but they've been sold a number of times and they're now owned by Warner Brothers. And when I tried to contact Warner Brothers, I didn't get to first base. Okay, and then I had hoped that maybe McFadden archives existed, and I got nowhere. So I couldn't, I would have liked to find if there were letters, like letter was worth $1 million to me, of that sort. I actually found one interesting newspaper article in a New Jersey newspaper about their summer in Copake Falls. Going to the usual newspaper sources that I use, like the one that the library has, where you actually have to get to something that says news. You might not guess that that would take you to because you might think it's present day news. But with the library's help, I found a lot of sources about Rheinstrom and his wife. Anybody else?
So Rheinstrom Hill, is there a building there now?
His house is there. It's occupied by a former employee who was a major source for me. But interestingly, and this man had been devoted to Carroll, but he was of the belief that I shouldn't write a biography of Carroll. And it took some persuading before I could get him to agree to tell me. And then he came up with some good stories. And he lionized Carroll. He said, I always call him, and he still calls him Mr. Rheinstrom, talking to me. I take the liberty of calling him Carroll. I don't know that it would have to his face. But anyway. What's the question?
Was there a building?
Yeah. Okay. So his house, his guest house, the log cabin that they stayed in 1934, and maybe for a year or so, I'm not sure, because they couldn't live in the house. It was such a wreck. And at one point, a family friend came along and lived in their barn. The barn's gone, and redid the house so that they could move in. And
Did
there's
they
a couple-
build the house or did they buy the property with the house on?
What they bought was 9 acres with these buildings on it. But as soon as they moved in, neighbors started to call. They heard that this rich man from New York City had bought the property, excuse me. And so they said, hey, Mr. Rheinstrom, I'm so-and-so, I live down the hill from you. And I have a woodlot piece of property that is adjacent to yours. Any chance you'd be interested in buying it? And Rheinstrom said, well, maybe, and he bought it. And then people heard that this one person had bought it, and other people called. In addition to that, Irene became a real estate agent in the late 30s, and apparently was fairly successful. At one point, she had an office in Hillsdale. You know that red office? I think it is a real estate office still, next to the road that goes down to Harrington. That was her office in Hillsdale. She had one office in what's the town south of us? No, southwest.
Oh.
Anyway, whatever that town is, and she had an office in New York City.
Who's this, his wife?
Pine Plains.
His wife did, yeah. And she was a tough cookie. She did very well. In fact, as I told the folks who were here 2 weeks ago, a man from the Nelson family, which still lives on Rheinstrom Hill or near, died, and she came to pay a condolence call. But the first words out of her mouth was, you know that piece of property you have up there, would you be interested in selling it now? Maybe she had asked the man who had died, and he said no. So she was a tough cookie. Yes.
You hadn't heard about him, and I hadn't until you enlightened me. But he he was kind of, there's Rheinstrom Hill, for people who know that, but he owned the property. But it's not like our community of little hamlets and such have a lot of benefactors. And he was, I don't know the number that he contributed, but is there a plate at the high school because he's responsible for the pool? And then when his name became familiar, there's an
That's a good question.
office in the town hall. But prior to
Let me tell
this,
you, if you go to the swimming pool, you probably won't see anything with Rheinstrom's name on it because you'll walk by the plaque. And it's a sort of a bronze plaque. It doesn't jump out at you. And I suspect that if I asked 100 kids who were swimming in the pool or adults, maybe none of the kids would know that this was built with Rheinstrom's money. And a few of the adults might be aware of it if they were around when the bond issue was passed and people knew that the Rheinstrom Foundation would pay the $2 million over a few years. And the same thing in town hall. If you go into the conference room, there's a name thing there. It says Rheinstrom Conference Room. And there's probably no reason why most of us would look at that, and if we hadn't heard it, today, I wonder who was Rheinstrom, but he gave money to the town. So actually, I'm on not a crusade, but something like that. I spoke to the person who's the director of the Audubon facility, and she and I agreed that the little cardboard sign that's flapping in the wind on 7 is not adequate. So I'm going to prepare the text and some photos, because I've got all the photos. Because Rheinstrom Hill, the story is in here. So, and then maybe up, what's the name of the road? Cambridge Road, where people can, get out of the car and see it. We'll have a bigger thing, that will have more of the story. But you're asking a very good question.
well, people love to read these historic plaques
Yeah.
and such, and there's like, not that he was, besides being a successful businessman,
Yeah.
you know.
Thank you. Yes. I just want to stop them. If anybody's interested in a book, I have some here. Anyway, you had a question.
Yes, you said he was in advertising for many years. In what capacity did he function? Did he write copy or?
He first worked for True Story magazine. And in McFadden's early years, he was publishing a low-class publication.
But
It's called,
he was in the executive end of it. He wasn't a creative. That's what-
well, I don't know that.
Oh, you don't know
I
if
don't
he
know
was
that.
creative?
I suspect he was creative. He wrote 2 books, so he was a writer.
Mhm.
But in the beginning, the magazines were not getting a lot of advertisers. And he changed that. He also changed the way in which the ads were written. And the style that he created was adopted by newspapers.
Mhm.
Okay,
So he was a creative.
so he was, I think he wrote copy, advertising copy. But,
A little
McFadden
marketing,
didn't
a
leave
little
some records
design,
for me.
yeah.
I want to tell you one other thing. I missed hearing about Rheinstrom. Pete Campbell, Lillian Campbell, who early in her life was a semi-pro baseball player during the end of World War II. Right? Did you know her?
I didn't know her, I know of her.
Okay. So she worked, and a lot of people in the community knew her. She was a big supporter of the high school basketball team, and she taught kids how to hit and stuff like that. So I interviewed her. And I interviewed her because of her, her episode as a baseball player. But I had no reason to ask her tell me about your working career, who you worked for. Because then I might have heard about Rheinstrom when she was alive. And she would have had, interesting things to say. And she had a good relationship with Rheinstrom too. What else?
One more.
One more.
The fellow who's living in Rheinstrom's house now, who you interviewed,
David Wheeler.
why did he feel you shouldn't be writing the biography?
Good question. He said because Mr. Rheinstrom was a private person. That was his rationale. So I can understand that, though I don't agree with it. Because Richard Koski, president of the foundation, and Ed Harrington felt that Rheinstrom warranted a biography, and they were right. Although I don't think they knew at the time why they were right. That they want, in fact, when they spoke to me about it, Richard said he wanted there to be a book in the library here. And he wasn't thinking that the book would sell otherwise. But
Maybe the man he referred to as a private person was just referring to that Rheinstrom didn't want his Jewishness being known.
well, there was no reason. I don't think he knew that Rheinstrom was Jewish.
Really? Oh,
I
well,
don't,
did you know him?
yeah, he kept it close. I mean, I said the president of the foundation, who knew him for a number of years, said, no, he's not Jewish. I said, yeah, I have the proof. I have
Well,
a-
maybe this man found out after he passed away that he was Jewish, and then he was trying to protect him.
Well, we can theorize. I have no evidence to that. Yeah, you could be right.